All right, so continuing with this cerebral arterial circle, what's underlined here are the actual blood vessels of the cerebral arterial circle. So again, the vertebral arteries merge into one basilar artery, and then next comes the posterior cerebral artery, which extends beyond the circle of Willis, but part of the posterior cerebral artery forms part of the circle of Willis. And then from there, moving anteriorly, is the posterior communicating artery, because they communicate with these two blood vessels, the posterior cerebral artery and the internal carotid artery. So that internal carotid artery, when it comes in, it's coming into the brain like so. There's your internal carotid artery that transitions to the middle cerebral artery. So a portion or a small region or section of the internal carotid artery forms part of the cerebral arterial circle. Then we have the anterior cerebral arteries that branch off of the internal carotids and go up towards the front of the brain, hence the name anterior cerebral artery. And then there's a short connection between the two, which is the anterior communicating artery. So those blood vessels make up the cerebral arterial circle, or the circle of Willis. If we look at a brain from below, inferior view, there's the circle of Willis. There's your vertebral arteries. There's the basilar artery. There's the posterior cerebral arteries. There's the posterior communicating arteries. There's a bit of the internal carotid arteries. There's the anterior cerebral arteries, and connecting them, the anterior communicating artery. All right? Okay, moving now to the torso. We have your ascending aorta, aortic arch, and then it drops down behind the heart, the descending aorta. Then that transitions to the thoracic aorta, the thorax. When it passes the diaphragm, it moves into the abdominal pelvic cavity. The aorta is now referred to as the abdominal aorta. And then it terminates where it branches into two other arteries that we'll get to. And from here, you only need to know the renal arteries. Right renal artery, serving the right kidney, and then the left renal artery. So I hope you can appreciate that there's many arteries you do not need to know. Excuse me. So down as we move inferiorly, the abdominal aorta ends and branches into the right and left common iliac arteries. And then they transition into the right and left external iliac arteries. After the internal iliac artery branches off, which you don't need to know that one, but there's the external iliac artery, right and left one. And then where are we? External iliac arteries, those transition into the thighs to form the femoral arteries. And then behind the knee, the femoral artery leads into the popliteal artery. Remember, behind the knee is the popliteal area region. So popliteal artery behind the knee. As you see here, there's your femoral artery, and it transitions behind the knee into the, I'll do it right this time, popliteal artery. And then that's all you need to know. No blood vessels into the leg or foot. Moving to the veins. So what we'll find out is the terminology for many of the blood vessels are similar with the arteries and the corresponding veins. So that helps. Okay, in the skull, we have the superior sagittal sinus, and that transitions into the transverse sinus, as we see here. and here, transverse sinus. And then the sigmoid sinus, meaning there's got to be kind of an S-shaped curve somewhere, and that is here, the sigmoid sinus, and also here. So, sorry, superior sagittal, transverse sinus, and then sigmoid sinus. And that transitions into the internal jugular vein, the right one in this case. And that drops all the way down, and where it contacts the right subclavian vein, then it transitions into the right brachiocephalic vein. Okay. You notice in the diagram here, there's the external jugular vein, the right one, and then there's your right vertebral vein. Terminology similar to the corresponding arteries. So there's your brachiocephalic vein, and then when the two brachiocephalic veins merge, you get the one superior vena cava that empties into the right atrium. I guess just zooming in here, there's your superior sagittal sinus right along there. There's the transverse sinus, sigmoid sinus, internal jugular vein. The others you don't need to know for this chapter. Jugulars. Okay, as I mentioned, there's your external jugular vein on the right side, the right vertebral vein, and then the right internal jugulars. They all merge at the subclavian vein, in this case the right side, and then from there, brachiocephalic, right brachiocephalic vein, superior vena cava. And this is one of the plaques from your lab supplement, from lab. And notice there is a discrepancy in the model versus what we normally have in real life. The model shows in blue some veins serving the face, draining the face. So here, that is going to be the external jugular vein. Okay? And then notice this blue vein is coming out from the skull, so that's the internal jugular vein. There. But notice the external jugular veins and the internal jugular veins go all the way down and hit the subclavian vein. In the model, there's a discrepancy. The external jugular vein merges with the internal jugular vein, and it shows one vein coming down to the subclavian. So that's incorrect. There should be two. Okay? So when you, I believe this is in our lab supplement, when you see that, that's a discrepancy from the real situation. Okay. Moving into the arms. Just like we did with the arteries, a lot of similarities. So radial and ulnar veins. This is the left side. Excuse me. There's the, in darker blue, the radial vein, right along the radius. And then there's the ulnar vein right along the ulnar bone. Okay? And those two, radial and ulnar vein, merge into one brachial vein, right in the anterior portion of the elbow up into the arm, the brachial vein. And that transitions to the axillary vein, which transitions to the subclavian vein. There's the clavicle, right? And then transitions to the brachiocephalic. The two brachiocephalics then merge into the one superior vena cava. But you notice there's a couple more blood vessels here, veins in the arm that we need to know. They are the cephalic, which is looking towards the thumb, or at the thumb. Notice more superficial, there's the cephalic vein. And it cuts across the anterior part of the elbow, and that's the median cubital vein. Okay? And then that comes over and merges with the basilic vein. The median cubital and basilic veins merge, and the basilic vein continues up, and that merges with the brachial vein to form the one axillary, and then the subclavian, and then the brachiocephalic and superior vena cava. So the medium cubital is the vein usually where you get blood drawn at the elbow. Median cubital vein. Let me see. Here we go. And that's it. Okay. So down at the lower extremity, the great saphenous vein is the longest vein in your body. And there it is right there, right? Medial aspect of your ankle, all the way up through the leg, past the knee, up into the thigh. There's the great saphenous vein. That merges into the femoral vein. Then the external iliac. All right, so again, the femoral vein transitions to the external iliac vein, in this case on the right side. Right, once you get into the pelvis, right external iliac vein. Then the common iliac vein, just like what we had with the arteries, right up there. After the internal iliac merges with the external iliac, then you have the right common iliac vein. And then the two common iliac veins merge into the one inferior vena cava, which we don't see here, but we will see in the next picture. The inferior vena cava, which goes up, up, up towards the heart. And also merging into the inferior vena cava and the abdominal cavity, abdominal pelvic cavity, are the two renal veins draining the kidneys, hitting the inferior vena cava again, or merging into the inferior vena cava. Oh, and then that empties into the right atrium of the heart. Okay, just what you see here. Fetal circulation of the fetus, human fetus. So the fetal lungs do not breathe air. If anything, they're moving in and out amniotic fluid. So they are not responsible for gas exchange in the fetus. But the fetus needs oxygen and nutrients. They get it from the mother via the placenta and the umbilical cord. So there's a few bypasses or shunts, particularities in the fetal circulation that we do not have once we're born. So respiratory gases delivered and removed via the lifeline, the umbilical cord. So we have umbilical arteries. And notice A, arteries. They are carrying blood away from the fetus's heart. There you go. Umbilical arteries, notice they're kind of lavender, bluish in color because they're carrying oxygen-poor blood away from the fetus towards the mother to drop off carbon dioxide. The umbilical arteries down here. Okay? Once you're born, those degrade and are no longer functional. Heading towards the umbilical cord. Then the mother, where she deals with the removal of the carbon dioxide from her lungs. Okay? The umbilical vein, right? Voyage back to the heart. So, umbilical vein in red. Voyage, blood moving towards the heart via the umbilical cord. Notice it's red, carrying oxygenated blood from the mother to the baby. The ductus venosus, notice right here, ductus venosus. It is a shunt going from the liver, excuse me, to the inferior vena cava, right there. And then in the right atrium, there's a hole that allows blood to move from the right atrium to the left atrium. In you, your blood goes from your right atrium down into your right ventricle and then into the lungs for gas exchange. Well, the fetus doesn't really need to do that because the umbilical vein, the ductus venosus, are transporting oxygenated blood from the mother into the right atrium. In you, it's oxygen-poor blood from the systemic circulation that's coming into the right atrium. But the blood coming into the fetus's right atrium has plenty